For centuries, people have come to New Orleans looking for a fresh start, like the legendary Casket girls.
My first introduction to the supernatural treasure trove that is New Orleans was through the TV show The Originals, full of vampires, witches, and werewolves battling for power in a city thriving off secrets hidden in above-ground tombs and gothic imagery that can only be a facade for so long. I was enchanted. And to this day, New Orleans is the place in America at the top of my bucket list to visit. The French Quarter, beignets, Bourbon Street, I've heard you have to do it at least once, Lafayette Cemetery, ghost tours and vampire walks, and the Ursuline Convent, which is the stage for the tale I'm discussing today, where it is said that the Casket girls, women and girls who came from France as wives for French colonizers, harbored vampires that they traveled with from France, or else where they may have stayed themselves between preying on the citizens of New Orleans. They were aptly named after the cassettes they carried to travel, supposedly thought to hold their dowry from the king. As time has gone on, the French cassette, meaning a small trunk or suitcase, has been anglicized into casket and eventually casket. And, as you can imagine, the legend has taken up that these were not in fact small trunks, but instead long coffin-shaped boxes. And after these caskets were found empty in the third floor of the Ursuline Convent, the legend questions whether what was truly carried in these caskets was in fact the undead. And this speculation is what caused the Ursuline nuns to seal off that third floor, where vampires still may be housed to this day. As in the nature of the oral tradition, there are various iterations of this legend where things have been changed and adapted over time, and even with the historical facts of this story, there are varying accounts that I have found due to the nature of record keeping at the time. So please do take everything said in this video with a pinch of salt, but enjoy this spooky tale to celebrate Halloween. But with that said, let's talk a bit about the Casket or Casket girls. And to do that, we first have to start in the French colony of Louisiana. Part 1, Creating New Orleans. It's important to recognize that the French colony of Louisiana was originally indigenous land colonized by the French in the 1600s. La Louisiana, or French Louisiana, was named after Louis XIV of France, becoming a French colony in 1682, and it's not until 1803 that the Louisiana Territory was acquired by the United States in the Louisiana Purchase. However, our focus remains on French-occupied Louisiana in the 1700s. At this time, the colony was facing a potential population crisis, as the colonizers sent to Louisiana were mainly men, picked for their physical capabilities. And whilst the Casket girls were to be sent to New Orleans to help with this population crisis, they were not the first girls sent to a French colony to become wives. It had been seen previously between 1662 and 1673 that about 800 young women took King Louis XIV's offer of a small dowry and free passage across the Atlantic to move to the colony of New France to help populate the area. The area that was New France is now part of modern Canada, and the legacy left behind by the French colony is that the French language is still widely spoken in areas such as Quebec. This immigration of French women as wives was necessary, as by the 1660s, New France had run into a problem that the Louisiana colony would later know well. The unmarried Frenchmen had radically started to outnumber the unmarried French women in the colony, and without means of reproducing a new French generation in the colony, it would be vulnerable to invasion from the English and Spanish. The women who were sent to New France were nicknamed the Filles du Roi, or the daughters of the king, and whilst many were poor, some came from respectable families that had simply fallen on hard times. All of them were considered of marrying age at the time, being between 12 and 25, which is kind of insane, 12-year-olds being marrying age. The promise of a better life across the Atlantic and the almost guarantee of a husband who has the chance of success in a new colony was an appealing offer to those who did not have many luxuries back in France. And the women came with almost a quality assurance, as they had to have a letter of recommendation from their home parish saying that they were virtuous and virgin girls to cross the Atlantic. The hope was that sending good, respectable French women would help reproduce such quality in this colony. Within 6 months of their arrival, an overwhelming majority of the Fille de Roy were married. When Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville, the governor of Louisiana, asked the French government to send respectable virgin wives for the French colonists of Louisiana, he was most likely hoping for a situation similar to the Fille de Roy, where respectable women suitable of marriage would come with a dowry. He received 28 girls handpicked for his requirements between the ages of 14 and 19. The Pelican Girls, as they became known after the ship they arrived on, landed in 1704 and quickly realized that the better life they were expecting in the colony did not yet exist. In Mobile, where they landed, the food quality and living conditions were poor, something the Pelican Girls objected to. In fact, they staged something known as the Petticoat Rebellion to demand better conditions, which meant refusing bed and board to their husbands until these conditions were improved. Unsurprisingly, it didn't take long for this to happen. So, for context, the French colonizers established 3 main outposts along the Gulf Coast. These were Mobile, which is now Mobile, Alabama, Biloxi, and then later New Orleans. So it's not until 1718 that Bienville founds New Orleans due to its optimal place for trade along the Mississippi River. So as I've touched on already, there was a need for women in the colony to help establish a French stronghold in the area, especially as Bienville did not want to risk French men in the colony engaging in sexual relationships with indigenous women, as this would increase the potential of weakening the French stronghold even more. And the creation of New Orleans meant there was more area to populate and more men in need of wives, especially as Bienville described many of these men as wild and thought marriage would help maintain order. As such, further shipments of women arrived from France, and it was one of these shipments of potential wives that is said to have delivered the Casket Girls to New Orleans. Part 2. The Casket Girls. The filles à la cassette, better known as the Casket or Casket Girls, arrived in the port of New Orleans from France at some point in the 1720s. Some sources say 1721, although other sources say not until 1728. And this was under the cover of night with no guidance for the boat. They just simply appeared. And many may have doubted whether the ship would ever arrive at all, as the entire voyage took them 6 months. However, originally it was only anticipated to take 4. There's a very real chance that they may have thought that the ship went down in the sea and that all on board had died. However, there are versions of the legend that disagree with this order of events. Some say that the Casket Girls were never specifically sent to New Orleans from France, but rather were part of one of those shipments of women sent to Mobile, such as the Pelican Girls, who later were moved to New Orleans. But whether they appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the night after being presumed dead, or simply were moved by the colonizers themselves, they are still shrouded in legend. Upon their disembarkment of the boat, the men of New Orleans started murmuring of how pale these young women looked, to the point that some say their skin began to redden and blister under the Louisiana sun. The men had been expecting young, strong women to help with their repopulation effort, but the women and girls arrived in various states of ill health, some with bleeding gums or coughing up blood. Others were weak and deathly pale. For the men of New Orleans, this was unexpected and, even for some, deeply suspicious. In fact, many of the men soon started to question who, or what, truly disembarked that boat. Soon after the arrival of the Casket Girls, illness swept the city and death rates doubled. This only added fuel to the fire of those who were speculating that the girls were, in fact, vampires, escaping to terrorize the city of New Orleans in the cover of night. The Casket girls were said to live with the Ursuline nuns, also known as the Order of St. Ursula, who founded a school quickly upon their own arrival in 1727. The Casket attended this school and lived with the nuns prior to their marriages, with the nuns acting as a type of guardian for the girls' virtue between their arrival and their marriage. While some believed that the cassettes, that in reality would have been small wooden boxes or trunks, held the dowry from the king as suggested by the Fil-de-Roy who went to New France. King Louis XIV had in fact been dead since 1715. It is speculated that it was actually the French government that granted Bienville's request for more women, not the king himself. Others believe that the cassettes would simply have held what meager belongings they brought with them to start their new lives in New Orleans. And nonetheless, reports claim that the cassettes that accompanied the Casket girls were noticeably and abnormally heavy as they were unloaded from the boat. The legend varies, with some saying the Casket girls were vampires carrying their own sleeping quarters with them, whilst others suggest that the Casquettes held undead companions, and the paleness of the girls upon arrival was due to them allowing their companions to feed on their blood during the voyage. The story goes that the cassettes of the girls were taken to the third floor of the Ursuline Convent to be stored until the girls were married, and many speculated what made the cassettes so heavy, especially with the rumors surrounding the girls themselves and the uptick in deaths upon their arrival. One night, the Ursuline nuns are said to have gone up to the third floor and opened these cassettes, only to find them completely empty. They believed that perhaps the occupants were out under the cover of night, having flown out of the third floor windows. So legend goes that the shutters on the third floor were sealed shut with nails blessed by the Pope. I have heard people say that between 800 and 8,000 nails were used. And it's said that when one of these shutters blew open due to Hurricane Katrina, before the relief effort had even been completed, new nails blessed by the Pope were flown in and those shutters were sealed once again. Ever since, nobody from the public has been permitted to enter the third floor of the old Ursuline Convent. The thought was that by sealing any vampiric entities into this third floor, they would not be able to wreak havoc on the residents of New Orleans, or otherwise that any vampires out prowling the streets come daybreak would die in the rising sun. There are some who believe that vampires still occupy the third floor of the old Ursuline Convent, where they were sealed all those years ago. And to add to the mystery of this legend, in the 1970s, two paranormal investigators stayed overnight, without permission, I will add, in the grounds of the old Ursuline Convent after they claimed to have seen one of these shutters open. They were hoping to see some evidence of vampiric activity. But when the next morning came, these two investigators were found drained of blood, and their recording equipment seemingly had stopped recording of its own accord. Part 3. Counter-narratives. Could there really have been vampires delivered to New Orleans under the cover of women to be married? Were these vampires who were running from a crowd closing in on them in France? And were the Ursuline nuns tipped as secret keepers for the supernatural underbelly of New Orleans as it began to rear its head? Or is there just a much simpler explanation? Well, to start, the Casket girls were women and girls who were transported on a ship. Those of you familiar with sailing superstitions at the time will be aware that it was considered bad luck to have women on deck of a sailing ship. So as such, these women would have been kept below deck for the 6 months of their voyage. Similarly, classic sailing diseases like scurvy from a lack of vitamin C were rife, and they were said to have contracted yellow fever from a stop in Cuba. As such, a lack of sunlight and illness would account for their supposed paleness upon arrival, and also their ease of burning, as they have had no UV exposure, and vitamin C is known to limit UV damage. Thus, a lack of it could have contributed to the Casket girls being seen to burn easily. The yellow fever they contracted in Cuba is perhaps the illness that they passed on to the colony upon their arrival, due to the vast possibility of disease to be carried and spread in the close quarters of the city. And whilst that's a reasonable explanation now, as we know how diseases are spread, this is not information they would have had at the time. In terms of the empty cassettes, it's entirely possible that someone managed to break into the third floor and steal the dowry that was assumed originally to be within the cassettes, therefore leaving them empty when the nuns went to look. It's also possible that the cassettes were simply a fabrication or ruse designed and manufactured to be extremely heavy, even though they were empty, to try and make the Casket girls seem like appealing wives and therefore increase their chance of a good marriage. I find it particularly interesting to consider the role the Ursuline nuns and the old Ursuline convent play in this story. Whilst the Ursuline nuns had set up a school in 1727, as we've said, and resided in Colley House, the city did not build their first convent until 1734, and the existing old Ursuline convent was not finished until 1752 or 1753. By this point, the Casket girls would have been long married. They never would have lived in the old Ursuline convent. However, some believe that when the nuns moved to the old Ursuline convent on Chartres Street, they purposely walked in a procession rather than being transported in a covered carriage as they were normally seen travelling, to distract from what was being carried with them, those distinct caskets. In this version, they sealed the caskets and those that resided in them in that third floor of the old Ursuline convent, and that is where they remain today, with vampires still existing in that third floor. Many even speculate that now and again you can see the shutters on the third floor blow open when one of the residents escapes for the night. Others would say this is potentially leftover structural damage from Hurricane Katrina, which did do quite a number on the old Ursuline convent, although it was all repairable and it is still standing. However, now the old Ursuline convent is not in use by the Ursuline nuns, as they moved again in 1824. The building has had many uses throughout the years, but it is currently a museum where the public can visit and take guided tours. They still don't allow visitors up to that third floor. Regardless of whether you believe the legend of the Casket girls or not, it's impossible to ignore the folklore and legends that New Orleans is steeped in, from vampires to witches to ghosts. And one thing most of us that are interested in folklore will tell you, most myths, however spectacular now, are rooted in some form of truth. And say what you like, but many residents of New Orleans still refuse to walk past the old Ursuline convent at night, with accounts stating that people have felt eyes watching them from that mysterious third floor.